And good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome Sarah Johnson, who's helping me this morning presentation of this message. Sarah's one of our elders and preschool teacher at Giving Tree. She helps lead the young adults group, and so joy to have you with us, Sarah. Now, I want to start right off the bat by acknowledging that those two passages we just heard don't really sound like they belong on a Mother's Day Sunday. But this month we're highlighting mothers and women in our series, A Woman's Voice. So even though the message today isn't totally focused on being a mother, we're not ignoring that either, as you're going to see. But the question remains, why are we looking at these two stories for our series about the importance of hearing women's voices? Let's begin with a review. So last week we saw that God has created men and women to steward the world for Him as equal partners, working together to bring the goodness and the fruitfulness of creation to its fully mature end. That includes the stewardship of the earth and its resources, and the development of societies and culture, technology, and all of those things. Excuse me. But in order to steward well, we have to be guided by God's wisdom. He is the creator. He's the one who designed the earth, who designed human beings. He's the one who knows what we need to function well, to live in His blessing. And to highlight that, we opened our service today with this call to worship that was taken from Proverbs 8, which urges us to seek for wisdom.
Oftentimes when we think of wisdom, we think of knowledge, and so we think of the elderly. They've gained more knowledge over time, and so they're wise. But the Bible, in defining wisdom, adds to that. It's the pursuit of understanding and preserving order in the world. It's seeing things from God's perspective and in accordance with His will and nature. In contrast, folly, or a fool, is one who brought disorder by their behavior or thinking, one who did not fear the Lord and therefore tried to find coherence in something or someone else, usually themselves.
So in Proverbs 8 and 9, we see wisdom personified as a woman. Now, even though this is only a literary device, it's kind of notable that in a very strongly patriarchal society, when the author wants to depict the consummate goal in life, which is to know wisdom, he uses a female figure who speaks for God, speaks with God's authority, summons everyone, expects to be heard, expects to be obeyed, and issues stern warnings of severe consequences for those who don't respond rightly. Now, given that the primary audience for these proverbial sayings would have been the male sons of the ruler, or the male sons of a father in a household, we might expect that he'd use a male figure instead. So the men who are writing and studying this wisdom literature indicate by this that they do not assume that a female figure as a portrait of wisdom is incoherent or nonsensical. They don't assume that women are necessarily or inherently given to folly. They don't assume that women are always foolish. Women could be foolish, or they could not be foolish. They could also be wise. And wisdom is associated with God's point of view.
When I read Proverbs 8, it immediately brings me to attention, and it makes me want to hear more. The very first verse says, "Listen as wisdom calls out. Hear as understanding raises her voice." And then in verse 6 it says, "Listen to me, for I have important things to tell you." So teaching preschool, I would say 95% of the time, only half the class is listening to me. Found that if there's something, and that's okay, but I found that if there's something that I really need the whole class to hear for a safety issue or instructions of how we're going to do something, they will listen if I say, "I have big news to tell you, it's important, so I need you listening." And so when I read Proverbs 8, I feel like a preschooler eagerly awaiting what wisdom has to tell me. Proverbs 8 gives us several reasons to seek out wisdom. It's more valuable than rubies. Nothing you desire can compare with it. It leads to success, riches, and honor. It's associated with common sense, insight, and strength. It brings favor with God, which is the ultimate prize, a life that is marked by God's favor and blessing.
Now, our readings today are from two stories in the Old Testament which are not very well known. And in both instances, we see God using women's voices as a means for bringing his wisdom to his people in critical situations. The first story comes from a time in Israel's history before there was an established monarchy. There's no centralized government for the people. There's only tribal chieftains and a few well-known figures referred to as judges. These are tribal leaders or chiefs. They're primarily military leaders who defeated the surrounding clans or the small kingdoms that were attempting to assert their control over a portion of the land. And they would issue decisions in matters that are disputed. All of the judges who are named in the narrative are men, except for our first story, which features a female judge, Deborah. And during Deborah's lifetime, there's a Canaanite king, Jabin of Hatzor, and he's ruling over a portion of the land of Israel. You see where Deborah's home is indicated on the map, and Hatzor to the north is where the seat of power for this kingdom. The Israelites are oppressed, and they need a deliverer.
So Deborah is identified in three ways, each of which is significant. She is the wife of Lapidoth, who is otherwise unknown to us, but he must have been a known person or at least a verified name at the time of the writing. The fact that her husband is named, even though he does not actually figure into the story, signifies that she was not regarded as an oddity or an unusual person in her culture. Deborah describes herself in her song as a mother in Israel, and she sees this as a point of honor and significance.
She's also identified as a judge, meaning she is exercising some measure of local governance for a tribe or for the Israelites who live in the region of her home. She had a site which served as a place for her to provide judgment, where she would give counsel. And it was a certain palm tree near her residence between Ramah and Bethel. And the text tells us that, which indicates that Deborah was recognized as a judge by others throughout the region. People knew where to go to see her. And in addition to helping to resolve disputes, she apparently gave counsel or instruction or provided prophetic direction for Israelites who sought her out. And that's the third way she's identified, is as a prophetess, meaning she was recognized as a person through whom God spoke to the people. Her status as a prophetess is something that's also known among the people. Others come to her on the presumption that she has God's approval, she's able to speak for God. And as a prophetess, Deborah's accustomed to hear from God and to relay what he has said to others. Consequently, she issues a summons calling Barak to lead 10,000 men from the tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali against Jabin's forces, based upon what God has said to her or has showed her. What isn't immediately obvious to us when we read this is that Deborah is judging in Benjamin's territory, which is pointed out there to the south. She's issuing a divine command to two tribes, different tribes, that live further away up in the north. And God gives her the battle plan. She passes that on to Barak. Barak agrees to obey the summons, provided that Deborah comes along with him.
What we want to notice is that God was answering the people's cry for deliverance. He brought his word to them through Deborah, who was a recognized prophet and judge. Deborah wasn't the one who would lead the armies into battle, but she was the one who heard from God and gave God's counsel about how to go into battle. And she provided the God-given strategy for winning the battle that would bring deliverance to God's people.
So let's take a look at some key observations we want to make about this. First of all, the fact that Deborah is recognized by other tribes beyond her own indicates a certain level of fame or renown. So she's able to issue a prophetic command to another tribal leader and expect that it will be obeyed, because it comes ultimately from God. And she's recognized as someone who represents God, who speaks for God, and is therefore respected because she has God's approval. So people came to her, recognizing her ability to provide wise counsel and her ability to hear from God and speak for God. Deborah is therefore an example for us of a woman whom God used in a significant role as a local leader in this tribal system to influence others and to speak for him in powerful ways. She was instrumental in bringing deliverance to Israel and guiding the people, at least those who lived near her, for a long time. God used her voice, even though it went against the customs of the culture. It was an unusual and a remarkable action of God in the culture at the time, but it was consistent with his original design for men and women to be partners in stewarding creation.
I love the song of Deborah that follows our story in the following chapter of Judges. While Deborah recognizes her role as a messenger of divine wisdom to Barak, she still gives God the glory for their victory. And my favorite part of her song is in verse 12, where it says, wake up, Deborah. Wake up, break out in song." We see her spirit waking up to God's calling for her. And it reminds me of a time not long after I graduated college. I had gone home to see my family. We were sitting in the living room, chatting, just enjoying our time together. And I remember having this feeling of discontent in spite of the pleasant nature of the evening. And someone noticed that I was, not talking much, and so they asked me what was wrong. And I tried to explain that I felt like I was wasting my life away and that I should be doing something more meaningful in this broken world. And I got the impression that at least some of my family felt like I was being melodramatic. But I had a deep longing within me to do more and to be more. And it wasn't long after that when I started getting more involved in church, and I was really seeking out what God wanted for my life. And so I feel like it was that moment where God was telling me to wake up, I have things for you to do. And it's so easy to get comfortable in our everyday lives, and we leave God out of our plans. He might be calling to us and we don't even realize it because we're not listening for him or we're not seeking his guidance. We don't hear his call to wake up if we're allowing the noise of the world to drown it out. Another important lesson that we can learn from this story is that there are consequences to hearing God's commands and failing to follow through with them. God used Deborah's voice to speak wisdom to Barak, but rather than taking heed right away, he added his own stipulation to the deal. He would only go to battle if Deborah went with him. When we receive God's wisdom and he's telling us to do something, regardless of the source, we will only see the full value of God's plan if we commit to following through with his commands. In this case, the Israelites still won the battle, but Barak received no honor in the victory over Jabin.
Our second story comes from a time about a century later, but still before the Israelite monarchy is well established. Saul is king, but his kingdom is small, it's undeveloped. He's really more like a leader of an army of warriors, claims authority over the tribes. The tribes are only very loosely united. He's fighting on several fronts. He's defending Israelite lands against attacks from the Philistines on the west, other tribes on the east, all the while he's trying to kill David and defeat David's warriors. And so, as we heard the summary this morning, David is in the wilderness. He's there with a band of about 600 warriors, and they're surviving by providing protection for Israelites from these raiding parties that would come from the surrounding tribes and the small kingdoms around them. Nabal is a rich man, and his flocks and herdsmen, David has protected them. Nabal is also a very foolish and a wicked man. And so when David's messengers ask if he can offer them some food as payment for how they've watched out for his flocks and his people, he sends them away empty-handed, insults David, calling him, in essence, just a runaway renegade servant, not the anointed future king of Israel. Abigail, his wife, when she hears what has happened, recognizes the foolishness of her husband's arrogance, the danger that he's put them in, and she steps in to rescue the family and their business and their own honor. So let's just recap the main points here. where we started the reading, Abigail is gathering food, and she takes food for David and his men, enough to supply all of them. And she goes to intercept him on the way. She has anticipated what David's going to do when she heard what her husband had done. And so she goes to David and she humbles herself. She asks for forgiveness. She pleads for mercy. And she pleads for David to not give in to the desire for vengeance.
Some key observations about Abigail is that she worked quickly when faced with imminent danger, which tells us that she's known for being level-headed and decisive. Her servant recognized this quality in her when he appealed to her for help.
That also shows that she was perceptive, both practically and spiritually. She recognized the practical danger to her family in the situation. She took immediate action to deflect the threat. She also recognized the spiritual danger in the situation to David and therefore to the people of God.
We see Abigail as a voice of reason and respect, a calming and sensible presence in the midst of David's complex emotions. She diffuses his anger with gentleness and humility. She doesn't demand anything. She is courteous and treats him with respect and honor, countering the disrespect and dishonor shown by Nabal toward David. Abigail spoke courageously and boldly to David when it was needed, though.
But she didn't just come at him like another attack. She didn't just confront David. She also appealed to his better sense. She appealed to his own honor, to his godly character, and reminds him of his own history. She appeals to his generosity and his mercy. She appeals to his sense of propriety and honor, his godly submission to God and to Saul the king, and to his own integrity. She appeals to his own history, that he hasn't avenged himself on those who have wronged him and who have dishonored him, people like Saul.
Abigail demonstrates that she is a woman of faith. She speaks to David as someone who shares with him a faith in God. She's familiar with his story and recognizes him as the Lord's anointed, the one whom God has chosen to be Israel's king. And she affirms his status as the anointed king.
And David recognized God's wisdom when he heard her speak. He recognized that God had protected him from a rash, angry action that he was intending through Abigail. And what we see there is that God is commending Abigail for the steps that she took. She's prevented David from doing what he had planned, and what he had planned was murder. And she'd preserved David's ability to hold on to his spiritual integrity so that he would be able to say, I did not slaughter my way to the throne. David's been involved in a lot of battles. He's killed many of the enemies, but he had not attacked Saul, and he had not taken vengeance on any of the Israelites who had caused him great pain. And so we see in Abigail an example of God using a wife and a mother to bring godly wisdom to a critical situation that would impact not only her own family, but David's life and reputation, and therefore the course of the nation's history as well.
As I was reading this exchange between Abigail and David, it reminded me of a time in my life when I cried out to God during a period of heartache. Unfortunately, in my version of the story, I play the part of the emotion-driven David rather than the level-headed Abigail. I was hurting deeply and I didn't have any answers to alleviate the pain, so I asked God for help. I didn't know where to turn. And a friend's name was immediately brought to my mind, and it was a friend that I hadn't talked to in a long time. We had our children had started to grow apart, life was busy, and we just hadn't been in touch, but I still considered her a friend. But she wasn't someone I would have thought to call in that moment, had the Lord not led me to do so. And when I picked up the phone and made that call, I was shocked to hear that she had been through the exact same thing that I was going through. And instead of feeding into my negative emotions, she offered me godly wisdom that completely changed my perspective, and it allowed me to pursue forgiveness rather than anger. I knew that her advice was godly because the approach she took in her own life when faced with that same situation was to pray and immerse herself in Scripture until she knew what God wanted her to do. And as soon as I hung up the phone, I knew without a doubt that it wasn't a coincidence that her name had popped into my head when I cried out to God for help. He knew exactly who I needed to talk to and what I needed to hear. And there are so many what ifs that would have changed the outcome of this situation. What if I hadn't prayed to God at that moment? That friend's name likely never would have come to my mind since we hadn't been in touch. What if I hadn't listened to God's response to my prayer and I had never called her? What if I hadn't been open to hearing her advice and chose instead to dwell on my negative feelings? The outcome would have ended in conflict rather than peace. And what if my friend hadn't been through this similar situation before? It reminds me that sometimes God allows us to go through hard things so that we can later be the godly wisdom that someone else needs when they're going through that same type of heartache. But what if we do listen to God and we respond with faith and obedience? Our Bible study group has been studying in John 15, and it tells us that if we follow God's commands and we live in him, it brings us great joy. And so think of what he could be able to do through us if we just follow what he's asking us to do.
These two stories add some important reminders to our series about listening to the voices of women. Through these two women, we see two very different women, two different mothers, whom God used to bring his wisdom to his people in critical moments. Deborah was a woman, a wife, and a mother in a society and time when being a wife and mother was about the extent of the possibilities for women. But God called her, filled her with wisdom, and she served for years as a prophetess and a judge who gave out godly wisdom and counsel to Israelites from her tribe and even beyond her tribe to the rest of God's people. She obeyed God in the moment, and she stepped out to speak in a situation that wasn't exactly normal in her society, and it impacted the history of the nation. Now, let's not forget, she served for years as a judge and a prophetess, not just this one moment or this one battle. And she impacted many, many lives and families through her faithful sharing of wisdom from God. And yet she continued to identify primarily as a wife and mother in Israel. That's what she speaks. She calls herself that. She says, that's who I am. She didn't neglect her family in order to do what God had called her to do.
Abigail was not a leader in her community or tribe or anything like that. She was a wife and a mother. But her faithful and godly response in a crisis shows the wisdom of God. Her actions saved her family. And even though she didn't have any official position in the society, she had a huge influence that went far beyond her family. She influenced the course of Israel's history by impacting the most famous, important king in a crucial decision. God used her to demonstrate wisdom and recorded the incident for all of us to be instructed.
Now, you might not think of yourself as having much influence or having a lot of wisdom, not being like these famous Bible personalities. Maybe like Deborah, you know, well, I've got a little bit of influence in my immediate surroundings, on my job, or maybe in my family. That's about it, not much more. But what if God wants to expand your influence through your ability to share his wisdom with others? Or maybe you're like Abigail. I'm a wife and a mom. I don't have any other titles or positions. Maybe I'm not even a mother. Maybe I'm not even a wife. Maybe I'm not even a woman. And guys, we can learn from these stories as well, right? Because if you seek for God's wisdom, we're promised, if you pursue God and let him fill you with his enabling power, God will use your voice to shape your family for generations and impact the world in ways that you can't even imagine yet. Your voice is going to influence people for good or for ill. And many are the voices out there that are influencing people for ill. You've seen it in your own family. The voices that bring hatred or division or confusion or just pain. But what about the voice that can bring the wisdom of God into your situation and maybe impact generations and a nation? And you can't even see that yet. But we can see the one who has called us. Follow me.